As the recorder crackled to life, replaying that damning conversation, my stomach twisted into knots. There was no mistaking my wife's voice, soft, tender, laced with an affection I hadn't heard in years. But it wasn't for me. The realization hit like a gut punch, leaving me breathless. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what followed. Desperate for support, I turned to her mother, expecting at least some semblance of understanding. Instead, she met my gaze with an unsettling calm and uttered something that flipped my entire world upside down. Her words struck like a thunderclap, shattering every assumption I had about my marriage, my family, about myself. But before we get into the depths of this story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Nathan, the husband, was a devoted man, steadfast in his role as a provider, deeply committed to his family, yet often weighed down by societal and traditional expectations. His wife, Sophia, was a woman of quiet strength, sensitive yet resilient, but over the years, she had begun to feel lost, trapped beneath the weight of her responsibilities. Taking a deep breath, Sophia's voice trembled as she finally let go of the burden she had carried for so long. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted, her hands twisting in her lap. "From the very first year of our marriage, I felt stuck. The constant pressure to be the perfect wife, the ideal daughter-in-law, it was suffocating. Every choice I made revolved around someone else. Your family's approval. Our children's needs. Somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing myself." Tears welled in her eyes, her voice wavering between exhaustion and desperation. "I tried. God, I tried so hard to do what was right. To stay, for the kids, for the sake of our family. But every day, a piece of me faded away. I'd wake up and ask myself, is this all there is? Because it feels like I'm disappearing." Her voice dropped to a whisper, thick with guilt. "I thought about leaving," she confessed, glancing down. "Not because I didn't care. I do. But I couldn't breathe. I longed for freedom. And yet, the idea of tearing our family apart was unbearable. So I stayed, thinking I was doing the right thing. But in the end, I was just hurting both of us." Nathan stared at her, his mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low, pained. She exhaled shakily. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of disappointing everyone. But I never realized. I was failing myself." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Nathan sat frozen, his fists clenched, his normally steady gaze darting as if searching for something, anything, to hold onto in a reality that had just crumbled beneath him. Then, at last, he spoke, his voice raw and unsteady. "All this time, I thought we were building something together. But now, it feels like I've been living a lie." He stood abruptly, pacing as the emotions inside him threatened to spill over. "Was I so blind, Sophia? Did I really miss every sign that you were drowning? Or was I just too caught up in my own sense of control to see it?" His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I should have known. I should have been better. For you. For us." Yet even through the turmoil, there was a quiet steel in his tone when he turned to face her again. "I can't change the past. I can't erase the pain we've caused each other. But I'll be damned if I let this destroy our children's future. They need stability. They need to know they're not losing everything." Taking a deep breath, Nathan steadied himself, his resolve clear. "You may feel lost, but I'm not giving up on them. If I couldn't protect you, at least I'll protect them." His words lingered in the air, heavy with both grief and determination. Days later, as Nathan was tidying up his study, his fingers brushed against something buried beneath a mess of scattered papers, an old voice recorder. He picked it up, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. Little did he know, what he was about to hear would change everything. At first glance, the recorder seemed unremarkable, just another forgotten relic buried beneath the clutter. But something about it gnawed at Nathan, a strange unease settling in his chest. Curiosity won out. He pressed play. A moment of static filled the room before voices emerged, familiar, yet cutting like a blade. Sophia's voice, soft yet thick with emotion, filled the silence. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You've been my anchor when everything else felt like it was falling apart." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. His body stiffened. Then, another voice, deeper, steady, and unmistakable. His best friend. "You deserve to be seen, Sophia. I'll always be here for you, even if he isn't." Nathan's grip on the recorder faltered, his hands trembling. His mind reeled as he hit replay, desperate to convince himself he had misheard. But there was no mistake. The words played again, each syllable carving through him like a jagged blade. Their voices held an intimacy, an understanding he hadn't shared with Sophia in years. The weight of realization settled on his chest like a boulder. His face contorted in a mix of anguish and fury, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts as the walls seemed to close in. The recorder slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the desk, but he barely registered the sound. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice hollow, almost pleading. Memories of his best friend rushed forward, shared laughs, unshakable trust, the brotherhood they had built. How many times had the three of them been in the same room, exchanging pleasantries, while this betrayal simmered beneath the surface? The door creaked open, snapping him back to the present. Sophia stepped inside, pausing when she saw the look on his face, pale, shaken, the recorder sitting between them like a ticking bomb. "Nathan? What's wrong?" she asked cautiously, but there was something else in her eyes. A flicker of guilt. He didn't answer right away. He simply stared at her, the disbelief in his gaze shifting into something far darker. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but laced with the force of a brewing storm. "You. Him. How long?" The blood drained from Sophia's face. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. I can explain." Nathan let out a bitter laugh, sharp and humorless. "Explain?" His voice rose, no longer restrained. "Explain how my wife and my best friend managed to stab me in the back without me even seeing it? Explain what he gave you that I couldn't?" She stepped forward, her hands trembling, reaching for him. But he pulled away, his anger burning too hot. "Don't." The single word came out like a growl, sharp enough to make her flinch. His voice cracked as he continued, but the rage didn't waver. "I heard everything, Sophia. Every word. You leaned on him when you could have come to me. You chose him." Tears spilled down her cheeks, her breath hitching. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she choked out. "I was lost, Nathan. You didn't see me anymore. And he listened. He made me feel understood." Her confession cut deeper than the recording ever could. Nathan's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he fought against the emotions threatening to consume him. "You think that justifies this?" His voice dripped with disbelief. "While I was breaking my back for this family, you ran to him for comfort? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sophia sobbed openly now, her voice fragile. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I was drowning, and he was just there. I know it was wrong, but you did it anyway," Nathan roared, his voice shaking with fury and heartbreak. "You betrayed me, Sophia. And he betrayed me, too. The man I trusted like a brother." The finality of his words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, suffocating them both. Sophia collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. But Nathan didn't move toward her. He didn't offer comfort. He couldn't. Instead, he turned toward the door, his shoulders tense, as if carrying the weight of the world. "I can't even look at you right now," he said quietly, his tone void of warmth, of anything familiar. He paused at the doorway, his back still to her, his voice steadier now despite the storm raging inside him. "This family may be broken, but I'll be damned if our kids pay the price for your mistakes. Whatever it takes, Sophia, I'll protect them." With that final vow, Nathan turned on his heel, his body rigid with fury. He walked away without another glance, stepping into the house, where the other victims of this mess, his children, deserved more than the wreckage left behind. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sophia remained frozen in place, her breath shaky, her tears falling unchecked. The recorder sat between them, now silent, but the weight of what had been said still echoed in the room. She lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "What have I done?" Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, mirroring the storm brewing within Nathan as he stalked into a dimly lit café. The place had once been their sanctuary, a refuge where he and Matt had shared years of laughter, trust, and brotherhood. Now, it felt suffocating, thick with the bitter taste of betrayal. Matt sat at their usual table, his fingers curled around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. As he glanced up, his shoulders tensed. He knew this moment was inevitable. Nathan didn't bother with pleasantries. He stopped short of the table, his presence towering, his voice low and lethal. "You." The word came out like venom, his fury barely restrained. "Of all people." Matt pushed himself to his feet, trying to appear composed, but the air between them was charged, every unspoken word waiting to explode. "Nathan, listen. I didn't mean for it to happen." Nathan let out a bitter laugh, humorless and sharp. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" His voice climbed, thick with disbelief. "You didn't mean to go behind my back? To take what wasn't yours?" His hands shook as he slammed the table, rattling the cups and drawing a few wary glances from the barista. But he didn't care. Matt's expression hardened. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet defensiveness beneath it. "She was broken, Nathan. She needed someone to see her, to listen. You stopped doing that a long time ago." Nathan's breath hitched. He took a step closer, his frame towering over Matt, his anger barely contained. "Don't you dare put this on me." His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of everything he was holding back. "I trusted you like a brother. I let you into my home, my family. And this is how you repay me?" Matt flinched, just barely, but he stood his ground. "I didn't set out to hurt you," he said quietly. "But I couldn't just stand by and watch her suffer. You don't know what it was like for her, Nathan." Nathan's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Oh, and you do?" His voice dripped with contempt. "What gave you the right to step into my marriage? Into my life? You think you're the hero here?" Matt's eyes darkened, guilt flashing before it was masked by something else, resolve. "I never claimed to be a hero," he admitted. "But someone had to fill the void you left. She was drowning, and you didn't even see it." Nathan turned away for a second, running a shaky hand through his hair as memories hit him like a tidal wave. Late nights venting to Matt over beers, confiding in the man he had considered family. Trust that had once been unbreakable, shattered. When he faced Matt again, his voice was rough with pain. "I gave you everything. My trust. My friendship. And you threw it all away. For what?" His voice broke slightly. "Was it worth it, Matt?" Matt exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He looked away, unable to meet Nathan's piercing gaze. "It wasn't about being worth it," he muttered. "It was about her. She deserved to feel loved, something you stopped giving her a long time ago." Nathan's restraint finally snapped. With a force that sent a chair skidding back, he lunged, grabbing Matt by the collar and shoving him against the wall. The dull thud echoed through the empty cafe, but neither man cared. Nathan's voice dropped to a deadly whisper, thick with raw betrayal. "You don't get to talk about love. Not after what you've done. Not after you betrayed me and my family." Matt winced but held his ground. His voice was uneven, but his words were steady. "And what about her, Nathan? Have you even stopped to think about how she felt? Why she turned to me?" His gaze hardened. "You were so focused on everything else, you forgot about her." Nathan's grip tightened before he shoved Matt back, his hands trembling with rage. "Don't you dare act like you did this for her," he spat. "You didn't save her. You destroyed her. You destroyed everything." Matt straightened his jacket, adjusting his collar, his breath unsteady. "Believe what you want," he murmured, his voice quieter now. "But at least I gave her something you couldn't, a reason to smile." Nathan froze. The word struck like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to seep into the room, its icy grip wrapping around him. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything that had just been said. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was an unshakable finality in it. "You didn't just lose me, Matt. You lost yourself." He held Matt's gaze for only a second longer before turning away. Without another word, he pushed open the cafe door and stepped out into the downpour. The heavy thud of the door swinging shut echoed the fracture in their friendship, a break so deep it could never be repaired. Rain soaked through his clothes within seconds, but Nathan barely noticed. His chest heaved as raw, unfiltered emotion surged through him. Anger. Pain. Betrayal. He tilted his head back, squeezing his eyes shut, and let out a guttural cry, one filled with all the words left unsaid, with all the things he could never take back. Inside, Matt sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, heavier than he had anticipated. He exhaled, a shaky breath meant to steady himself, but it did nothing to quiet the gnawing emptiness growing inside him. At least she knew someone cared. The thought drifted through his mind, something to cling to, a justification. But even as he repeated the words, they felt hollow. Meaningless. As empty as the space left behind in Nathan's absence. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room. The once warm glow of the house felt colder now, the air thick with unspoken tension. Sophia stood by the window, her hands wringing nervously as she watched Caleb, her eldest, sitting on the couch. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid. She had called him in to talk, sensing his growing distance, but now that they were face to face, the words felt heavier than she had anticipated. She swallowed hard, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb, I know you've been quiet lately. I need to know what's going on. Please, talk to me." He didn't move. Didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched. The only sound between them was the steady ticking of the clock. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't think you really want to know, Mom." Sophia flinched at the coldness in his tone, at the way he said Mom like it meant something different now, like it carried a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "I do, Caleb. Whatever it is, you can tell me." That's when he lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. The look he gave her made her stomach drop. His gaze wasn't just angry, it was wounded, filled with a sorrow so deep it cut through her like a blade. "I heard everything," he said bluntly. "You and him. I heard the truth." The room tilted. The breath left Sophia's lungs. "Caleb, I..." She started, but the words stuck in her throat. Caleb shook his head, his voice cracking under the weight of everything he was feeling. You lied to us. His words sliced through the air, leaving no room for defense. All those times you told us family comes first, that we should trust you. Was it all a lie? Were you pretending the whole time? Sophia reached out instinctively, her hands shaking. It wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you or your siblings. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I love you. I have always loved you. Caleb shot to his feet, stepping back as if recoiling from her words. His voice rose, thick with pain. How could you say that? His breath hitched. How can you claim to love us when you've destroyed everything we believed in? You weren't just my mom. You were the person I looked up to. And now. He trailed off, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears. Caleb, please. I don't know who you are anymore. The words landed like a thunderclap, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Sophia stood frozen, her arms falling limply to her sides. She wanted to reach for him, to explain, to make him understand. But the chasm between them stretched too wide, too deep. Caleb turned his back to her, his voice quieter now, but just as devastating. I used to think you were the strongest person I knew. That no matter what, you'd never let us down. But now. He let out a breath, shaking his head. I can't even look at you the same way. Sophia bit her lip, tears streaking her face. I'm still here, Caleb. I'm still your mom. But as he stood there, unmoving, staring at the floor, she realized, maybe that wasn't enough anymore. I'm trying to make things right. Sophia's voice trembled with desperation, but Caleb's expression didn't soften. If anything, the exhaustion in his eyes cut deeper than his anger ever could. Some things can't be fixed, Mom, he said quietly. You broke something in me. In us. And I don't know if it'll ever be the same. With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. Sophia stood frozen, watching him disappear. The weight of his words settled over her, pressing down until her knees buckled. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands covering her face as muffled sobs racked her body. I don't know who you are anymore. The words echoed in her mind, over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. As the last traces of daylight faded, she sat in the darkness, staring at the empty doorway, grief pooling in her chest like lead. She had lost so much, her marriage, her best friend, and now, the trust of her own son. But even in the depths of her despair, something inside her refused to break completely. A flicker of determination sparked in the wreckage of her guilt. She would fight for Caleb. No matter how long it took. The dining room, once a space filled with warmth and laughter, now felt suffocating. The air was thick with judgment, the silence stretched tight with disappointment. Sophia sat at the far end of the long table, shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the untouched tea and scattered snacks before her. Around her, her family loomed, her parents, her siblings, every one of them carrying the same expression of restrained fury. Her father paced back and forth, his footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. With each turn, his anger seemed to build, crackling like a storm on the verge of breaking. Finally, he stopped, his face red, his voice booming. Sophia, what were you thinking? She flinched. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? The shame you've brought us? Sophia opened her mouth, but before she could get a single word out, he cut her off, his voice rising. Your husband came to me. He told me everything. Do you know how humiliating it is to face the neighbors, the community, knowing what my daughter has done? Beside him, her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her voice trembling yet sharp. We raised you to put family first, Sophia. To live for others. But all you've done is think about yourself, your own desires. Sophia's hands clenched into fists on her lap. She gritted her teeth, trying to hold her composure, trying to absorb the weight of their words without crumbling beneath them. But then, something inside her snapped. Her chair scraped against the floor as she shot up, slamming her palm onto the table. The sharp crack made everyone flinch. "Who thought of me all these years?" she shouted, her voice raw with frustration. The air in the room grew unbearably thick. Her siblings exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats. "You talk about sacrificing for family, but when did anyone ask if I was happy? If I was okay? When did I ever get to be more than just a role to fill?" Her mother's expression hardened. She leaned forward, her voice cold. "We all make sacrifices, Sophia. You're not the only one. But instead of holding your family together, you tore it apart." The words landed like a slap, stinging more than Sophia had anticipated. She scanned the faces around her, searching for even a flicker of understanding, a sliver of empathy. But all she saw was judgment. Then, from the other end of the table, her brother, usually quiet in moments like these, spoke up. "You should have thought about the kids, Sophia. They're the real victims here." Sophia let out a bitter laugh, the sound trembling with emotion. "Don't you think I know that?" Her voice cracked. "Don't you think I live with that guilt every single day?" She gestured around wildly, as if trying to make them see what she had been carrying alone for so long. "But none of you understand what it felt like. Feeling invisible. Suffocated. Like I was just an expectation to meet, not a person." Her father shook his head, disappointment etched deep into his features. "That's no excuse." His voice was firm, unwavering. "Your actions have consequences, Sophia. Your husband was willing to fight for this family. Why weren't you?" The accusation stung. A fresh wave of tears blurred her vision. She looked down at her hands, nails digging into her palms, desperate to hold herself together. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "You don't understand. You've never understood." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Her mother sniffled, dabbing at her eyes again, but no one spoke. Sophia's gaze drifted to the mantel, where an old family portrait rested in a frame. A frozen moment from years ago, when smiles had come easily, when love hadn't felt so conditional, when the cracks beneath the surface had been hidden well enough to believe they didn't exist. Now, all she could see were the fractures. And she wasn't sure if anything could ever piece them back together again. The frame hung slightly crooked, its glass chipped at the corner, a fitting symbol of how fragile everything had become. The perfect picture of family, now fractured. Her father let out a heavy sigh, dragging a tired hand through his thinning hair. The anger in his voice had faded, replaced by sheer exhaustion. "You need to fix this, Sophia." His voice was quiet, firm. "For the kids, if not for yourself." Sophia lifted her gaze, her eyes swollen and red but unwavering. "I'm trying," she said, her voice steady even as tears continued to stream down her face. "But I can't fix this alone. And right now, all I feel is everyone pushing me further down." Her mother stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair against the floor cutting through the silence. "Then maybe you should think about what you've done and stop blaming others," she said coldly before turning on her heel and walking out. One by one, the others followed, each of them choosing to leave rather than listen. Sophia sat alone, staring at the chipped glass of the photo frame. Her mother's harsh words, her father's disappointment, her brother's judgment, all of it swirled inside her, a storm she couldn't quiet. The tea on the table had gone cold, much like the warmth that once existed in this family. She leaned back in her chair, her silent tears falling onto her lap. The room felt emptier than ever, the stillness pressing in on her like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. And yet, amidst the despair, something inside her burned. A flicker of resolve, faint but persistent. If no one else would stand by her, she would stand for herself. She had to. For her children. And for whatever was left of herself to salvage. The courtroom was thick with silence, the kind that suffocated, that made the walls feel closer than they were. The judge called the custody hearing to order, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Sophia sat on one side, her hands clenched tightly together in her lap. Across from her, Nathan sat rigid, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Between them, the fate of their children hung in the balance. Nathan's lawyer stood first, his tone professional, but the words cut deep. "Your Honor, Mr. Carter seeks full custody of his children. He has been the stable, consistent parent providing the structure and support necessary for their well-being. The actions of Mrs. Carter, as evidenced by her behavior, have introduced instability that no child should endure." Sophia's stomach dropped. Every word landed like a blow. She stole a glance at Nathan, but his face remained cold, though the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Then it was her turn. She rose slowly, inhaling deeply before speaking. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to hold steady. "Your Honor, my children are my world. They are the reason I have fought through everything. I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but I love them more than anything. I am working every day to be better, for them and for myself. They need their mother." The moment the words left her lips, Nathan shot up, his voice slicing through the courtroom. "And what about the damage you've already done, Sophia?" She flinched, his anger hitting her like a slap. "Do you think love is enough to erase that? To undo the chaos you brought into our lives? I have to protect them, from your choices, from the instability you created." Sophia turned to him, fire flashing in her tear-streaked eyes. "I made mistakes," she admitted, her voice rising. "But that doesn't mean I don't deserve to be their mother. You act like you're the only one who can protect them, but they need both of us, Nathan. They need to see that even broken people can heal." The judge raised a hand, calling for order, but the tension in the room remained thick, crackling between them. The lawyers continued their battle, arguing over evidence, character testimonies, every detail becoming another point of division. Finally, the judge sighed, leveling a steady gaze at them both. "This is not an easy decision," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But my primary concern is the children's stability." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering her ruling. "For now, primary custody will be awarded to Mr. Carter, with Mrs. Carter granted supervised visitation." Sophia inhaled sharply, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt. Nathan remained still, his jaw set, his gaze forward. The decision had been made. The gavel struck. And just like that, everything changed. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. She gasped, her chest tightening as the reality of it settled in. Her children, her anchor, her hope, were being taken from her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "No. Please." For a fleeting moment, Nathan's expression softened, the resolve in his eyes faltering. But just as quickly, he masked it, nodding stiffly toward the judge. The finality came with the sharp crack of the gavel. Sophia sat frozen, her mind spinning, her body numb. It was over. The days that followed blurred into a haze of silence and emptiness. The house, once filled with laughter and tiny footsteps racing down the hall, felt hollow. Their rooms remained untouched, toys still scattered as if waiting for their return. But they didn't return. She spiraled. Plates of untouched food collected on the kitchen counter. Her phone buzzed with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Friends reached out. Family called. But she ignored them all. The nights were the worst. The stillness pressed against her like a weight, amplifying the ache in her chest. Yet, amid the darkness, something shifted. One evening, as she sat curled on the couch, staring at a framed photo of her children, their smiles frozen in time, something inside her flickered. They still needed her. Even from a distance. She couldn't let them see her like this. Broken. Defeated. With trembling hands, Sophia made a choice. She would fight. She sought therapy, pouring out her regrets, her failures, her fears, finally speaking to someone who listened without judgment. She attended parenting workshops, determined to learn how to rebuild trust. She threw herself into community work, volunteering at local shelters and schools, finding purpose in giving to others. The victories were small at first. Getting out of bed. Cooking a full meal. Receiving a kind word from a stranger. But each step forward felt like proof that she could heal. Her supervised visits with the children became the light in her week. She read them their favorite stories, helped them with drawings, listened, truly listened, to their every word. And slowly, they began to respond. Her youngest clung to her when the visits ended. Her eldest, once distant, began meeting her gaze again, his walls cracking just a little. The road ahead was long. But she held on to hope, that one day, they'd see she was still their mother. Still worthy of their love. Months later, Sophia sat in the courtroom again. This time, her back was straighter. Her voice steadier. Nathan sat across from her, his posture less rigid, his anger no longer a shield. The judge observed her progress, acknowledging her commitment to change. For the first time, the conversation shifted, not about what she had done wrong, but about what she had done to make things right. Joint custody was now on the table. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. The battle wasn't over. But she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her place in her children's lives. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a small smile. She had fought. For them. For herself. And though there was much to mend, the cracks were finally beginning to heal. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Nathan, seated across the room, leaned forward, his voice resolute. "Your Honor, my priority is the children's safety and stability. Sophia has shown she cannot provide that. I need to protect them from the chaos her choices have created." Sophia's breath caught. Chaos. The word cut deeper than any blade. Her fingers tightened against the table as she lifted her chin, her voice rising with quiet fury. "Chaos," she echoed. "Yes, I made mistakes. But don't act like you were perfect, Nathan. You shut me out. You refused to see me. I am still their mother. They need me as much as they need you." The judge raised a hand, calling for order. Silence fell once more, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "Given the circumstances, primary custody will be granted temporarily to Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter will have supervised visitation." The gavel struck. And Sophia felt her world collapse, her knees wobbled beneath her, threatening to give out as the words echoed in her head. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "No, this can't be happening." Nathan cast a brief glance her way. For a flicker of a moment, something passed across his face, relief, regret, but he said nothing. And then it was over. The weeks that followed felt like an endless void. Sophia's home became nothing more than a hollow shell. Where there had once been laughter, there was now only suffocating silence. The children's rooms remained untouched, their toys and clothes frozen in time, remnants of a life that felt unreachable. She would sit for hours, staring blankly at the walls, the judge's ruling looping in her mind like a cruel taunt. Her phone vibrated constantly, messages of concern from friends, family, people who wanted to reach her, but she ignored them all. Food sat untouched. Sleep was fleeting. The weight of her despair pressed so heavily on her chest that even breathing felt like a chore. And the worst part? She blamed herself entirely. Maybe Nathan was right, she murmured into the stillness. Maybe I'm not enough. The thought clung to her, wrapping around her like chains, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Then, one evening, as she sat curled up in the dim light of her living room, a tiny voice cut through the fog of her despair. A memory. Her youngest child's voice, soft and certain, from their last supervised visit. "Mommy, I love you." The words stirred something deep within her. A flicker of warmth. A spark of hope. She realized that despite everything she had lost, there was still something, someone, to fight for. She refused to let her children see her like this. Broken. Defeated. So, she took a breath. And then another. And for the first time in weeks, she chose to fight. Change didn't come overnight. But step by step, Sophia began to rebuild. She sought therapy, unpacking years of guilt, pain, and regret. Her therapist listened without judgment, helping her confront the mistakes she had spent so long avoiding. Slowly, she started to see her past not just through the lens of shame, but through understanding. She joined a support group for single mothers, sharing her story and finding solace in others who had walked similar paths. She volunteered at a local shelter, channeling her pain into helping those who needed it more. Each small step forward felt like a battle won. But nothing compared to the moments she spent with her children. Her supervised visits became her greatest joy. She poured her heart into every second, reading their favorite books, coloring with them, listening intently to their stories. And slowly, they responded. Her youngest clung to her at the end of visits, refusing to let go. Her eldest, once cold and distant, started to soften. Even Nathan, who had once been so rigid in his resolve, seemed to take notice. His walls didn't crumble, but the edges of them softened, just enough for recognition to slip through. Sophia knew the road ahead was still long. But for the first time in a long time, she believed she could walk it. She couldn't change the past. But she could shape the future. For her children. And for herself. Losing custody of my children was the darkest abyss I had ever faced, Sophia would later admit. It was as if the world stopped turning. Even as she spoke those words, the pain still lingered in her voice. The silence of their absence had been deafening. The weeks following the court's decision had passed in a haze of regret and self-doubt. She had questioned every choice, every action, every moment that had led to this loss. But as time moved forward, she realized something. This pain had forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided. She hadn't just lost her children that day. She had lost herself long before. It wasn't just about losing them, she admitted. It was about losing the illusion that I was doing enough. That painful clarity became her turning point. As unbearable as the loss had been, it forced her to rebuild, not just for her children, but for the woman she wanted to become. At first, she resisted. She buried herself in denial, clinging to the belief that she had been unfairly judged. I was trying my best, she told herself over and over, justifying her past as she wandered through the emptiness of her home. But the weight of her children's absence chipped away at her defenses. And one evening, during a therapy session, her counselor gently asked, "Have you truly looked at your role in all of this?" The question struck like a lightning bolt. For the first time, Sophia sat with the uncomfortable truth. Not just the pain of losing her children, but the realization that she had to change if she ever wanted them back. The tears came suddenly, a flood of emotion crashing over her as memories surfaced, moments when she had chosen her own needs over her family's, times when she had been absent, distracted, failing to see the hurt she had caused. "I lost sight of what mattered," Sophia admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her own truth. "I was so focused on escaping my pain that I didn't see the pain I was causing them." For so long, she had told herself that she was trying her best, but now she could see the cracks in that justification. She hadn't just failed herself, she had failed them. But clarity, no matter how painful, was also a gift. As she continued to unpack her mistakes, she found a path forward. One day, as she shared in a support group, her realization became solid, no longer just a passing thought but a deep, undeniable truth. Losing everything made me see that I had put myself before my family for too long, she said, her voice steady but laced with regret. Now I have to put them first. Not just in words, but in every choice I make. That shift became her anchor. She understood now that acknowledging her faults wouldn't change the past, but it gave her something just as powerful, the clarity to rebuild with intention, with humility, with the determination to become the mother her children deserved. Sophia's journey toward redemption didn't come through grand gestures, but through small, intentional acts. She immersed herself in the community, not only to rebuild her life but to show her children, through action, not just words, that she was still here, still fighting for them. At their school, she volunteered to lead a recycling program, organizing workshops for parents and students. If I can be part of their world, even in little ways, maybe they'll see how much I care, she thought. It was her youngest child who responded first. During one of their supervised visits, the little one shyly handed Sophia a crayon drawing, 2 figures, holding hands. Sophia's heart swelled as she traced the colorful lines with her fingers, her voice gentle. "Is this us?" A hesitant nod. A small, uncertain smile. It was the first crack in the wall, the first sign that her efforts were beginning to reach them. Caleb, her eldest, was different. He remained distant, guarded. But over time, his walls, too, began to show hairline fractures. One afternoon, after watching Sophia direct a successful charity event for the school, he muttered under his breath, "You're really trying, aren't you?" Though his tone was hesitant, Sophia caught the faintest note of something else, acknowledgement. Maybe even a sliver of hope. She didn't push. She just met his gaze and answered simply. "Yes. For you. For all of us." As Sophia worked to rebuild her relationship with her children, her personal transformation began to ripple outward. A local parenting group invited her to speak, an offer she initially hesitated to accept. Who was she to give advice? But then she realized, her story wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about survival, about loss, about finding the strength to rebuild. So she stood before an audience of young mothers, her voice steady yet humble. "I lost everything," she began. "But in losing, I found what really matters. And I'm here to tell you that it's never too late to rebuild." After the talk, a young woman approached her, eyes filled with curiosity and doubt. "Do you feel like you deserve forgiveness?" Sophia paused. The weight of the question settled over her, heavy but not crushing. She met the student's gaze, her own reflecting the long road she had walked. "No," she admitted honestly. "But I will keep living in a way that earns it." A hush fell over the room, followed by quiet, thoughtful applause. She wasn't looking for validation. But in that moment, she felt something settle inside her, a deep, quiet resolve. Through her unwavering dedication, Sophia proved to her children, and to herself, that healing was possible. The trust she thought she had lost forever returned, piece by piece, as they witnessed her commitment rather than just hearing her promises. And then, one day, she found herself standing hand in hand with them at another community event. She looked down at their small fingers wrapped around hers, at the hesitant yet growing belief in their eyes. The road ahead would still have challenges. But she was no longer afraid of the work. Because for the first time in a long, long time, she knew she was walking toward something real. And she knew, without a doubt, that her love for them, and their willingness to believe in her, was worth every single step.